The sea is calm. Normally that should feel like a relief, but as we step onto the misty shores of Roanoke Island in August of 1590, alongside a man named John White, the silence is literally deafening. White has waited 3 agonizing years to return to this exact spot. Somewhere in the dense, quiet forest just ahead of him is his daughter, his newborn granddaughter, the very people he was trusted to lead. By all accounts, he should be sprinting toward them right now, but instead, he's just frozen on the beach, staring at nothing. There's no smoke rising from cooking fires, no voices echoing through the trees, no footprints in the sand but his own. The protective wooden palisade they built stands completely quiet, half swallowed by the tall grass. As he moves through the empty houses, the most unsettling part is what's missing. There are no bodies, no blood, absolutely no sign of a struggle. There is just silence and one single word carved very carefully into a wooden post: Croatoan.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving deep into a historical investigation of one of the most haunting true stories ever recorded. We're looking at a mystery that, honestly, even after 400 years, still has no complete answer. I mean, how do 115 men, women, and children just vanish into thin air, leaving behind only one cryptic clue? Now, to be clear, we aren't here to tell campfire ghost stories. We're here to look straight at the historical and archaeological facts of the lost colony of Roanoke and figure out exactly what the actual evidence tells us about their fate.
All right, let's set the stage with Part 1, 1587, A Colony of Families.
Which leads us right into Part 2, A Colony Under Pressure.
So back then, England was this rising power, and they were incredibly hungry for a permanent foothold in the New World. Sir Walter Raleigh decided to try a radically different strategy for this specific 1587 expedition. He didn't just send soldiers this time, he sent families. We're talking farmers, craftsmen, women, and children who were meant to build a lasting, everyday life, all led by John White. And initially, things looked promising. In August of that year, White's daughter gave birth to Virginia Dare, literally the first English child born on American soil. But that hopeful atmosphere, it evaporated almost immediately. The reality of Roanoke Island was incredibly harsh. Just think about these compounding factors for a second. The soil was exceptionally poor for the types of crops the English actually knew how to grow. To make matters worse, their late arrival put them perilously close to winter, and they had way too little stored food. But perhaps the most dangerous factor was the inherited hostility. See, a previous English military expedition had already committed acts of violence against the indigenous nations of the region. So these new colonists inherited a vicious conflict they didn't even start. Within weeks, one of White's own men was killed in a really tense encounter. The fragile trust with the surrounding indigenous communities was just rapidly deteriorating. The pressure was absolutely unbearable, and it forced them into a desperate decision.
The colonists realized pretty quickly they needed help from England, and they needed it fast. John White was chosen to sail back, largely because his standing with Sir Walter Raleigh gave their plea for help the best possible chance of being taken seriously. White reluctantly agreed to go, fully expecting to be back in just a few months. But before he left, they established this brilliantly simple signaling system. They agreed that if the 115 colonists were somehow forced to abandon the settlement while White was gone, they would carve their destination into a tree or a post. And, this is absolutely crucial, if they were leaving in danger or in distress, they would add a carved cross right above the destination. Just a simple, clear message left behind in case of emergency.
Okay, moving to Part 3, 3 years of silence.
So, White sails for England in the fall of 1587, thinking he'll be right back. Instead, it takes 3 agonizing years. Just look at this timeline. It is a tragedy of terrible timing. War broke out. By 1588, the Spanish Armada was bearing down on English shores. Because of this, every single ship capable of sailing, including the exact ones White desperately needed, was seized by the Crown for national defense. It was literally illegal for him to leave. In 1589, he tried anyway. He managed to secure a small, frankly poorly equipped voyage, but the unbelievable happened. It was attacked by pirates before it even reached the colony, forcing a badly injured White back to England completely empty-handed. It wasn't until August of 1590 that he finally secured safe passage back to Roanoke.
And while White was trapped in this massive international war across the Atlantic, think about the people left behind. 115 people. Men, women, and children, including a newborn baby, left completely alone on the edge of the American coast. No ships arrived, no word ever came. They were forced to face a second winter and then a third winter, entirely isolated. Whatever relationships they managed to salvage with the indigenous communities around them, those were literally the only things standing between them and total disaster. And somewhere during this dark, silent gap in time, a decision was made by those 115 people. a decision that would effectively erase them from history.
Which brings us to Part 4, The Return, August 1590.
With the Spanish threat finally eased, John White returns to Roanoke with a ship, a crew, and I'm sure a heart full of hope. But what he walked into was that haunting scene from our cold open. When White arrived, he didn't find a destroyed settlement. He found a deliberately dismantled one. The visual difference here is incredibly stark. The doors were removed, the windows were carefully boarded up. Even the heavy cannons were taken down. This was definitely not the chaotic aftermath of a sudden massacre or some panicked flight from an attack. No, this was the methodical, calm work of people who had planned to leave, packed up whatever was valuable, and simply walked away.
And then, of course, he found it. The word Croatoan carved into the post. But White noted the single most important detail of all: no cross beside it, no mark of distress. The absolute lack of that agreed-upon distress cross gave White immense hope. To him, it meant they weren't in immediate danger when they packed up. Now, Croatoan was the name of a nearby island, home to indigenous allies of the colonists. White immediately wanted to sail there to find them, but a massive violent storm rolled in, heavily damaging his ship's anchor cables. His terrified crew flat out refused to risk the dangerous waters any longer. With supplies dwindling and the weather turning, the expedition was forced to turn back to England. White never returned to America. He died never knowing what happened to his family.
Let's shift gears for Part 5, Facts versus Folklore.
To really get to the bottom of this, we need to take off our storyteller hats and put on our investigator hats. We have to separate the verified history from centuries of, well, campfire ghost stories. Let's lay out the facts. On one side, our confirmed history. 115 people go missing. They have a completely planned departure, and there's absolutely no evidence of violence or a struggle at the actual site. On the other side, you have the unsupported myths. Supernatural vanishings, alien abductions, or a sudden, complete massacre that somehow left zero trace. Look, these myths make for fantastic folklore, but they completely ignore the historical and archaeological record. We have to analyze this strictly as an unsolved historical case.
So let's look at Part 6, the leading explanations.
If they didn't just vanish into thin air, where on earth did they go? Let's walk through the structured theories that modern historians and archaeologists actually use to explain the colonists' fate, based on the very sparse historical breadcrumbs left behind. We'll start with Theory 1, integration. Honestly, this is by far the strongest theory, and it's the one most historians find best supported today. The carved word Croatoan points directly to modern-day Hatteras Island, which was home to the Croatoan people, documented allies of the English colonists. Interestingly, decades later, when the English settled Jamestown, they recorded persistent rumors of light-skinned, gray-eyed people living in regional indigenous tribes. Plus, oral traditions among some groups specifically reference white ancestors. It strongly suggests the colonists survived the only way they could, by assimilating into the very communities that were helping them.
Then we have Theory 2, inland relocation. Did they move deeper into the mainland forest? This one is super fascinating because it's supported by a highly controversial 16th century map drawn by John White himself. This map actually features a hidden symbol tucked right under a tiny patch of wax paper marking a possible inland fort. Modern excavations at a location they've dubbed Site X have actually turned up fragmentary colonial-era pottery. But it's heavily debated whether this proves the whole colony moved there or just a small splinter group.
Theories 3 and 4 look at disaster or conflict. Modern tree ring data has revealed a truly shocking fact. These colonists arrived during the absolute worst regional drought in 800 years. So starvation and severe weather were very real everyday threats. But here's exactly why these theories fall short as the only explanation. The calm, orderly dismantling of the fort completely contradicts a colony collapsing in a sudden crisis or a violent battle. Think about it. You don't carefully board up windows and neatly pack away heavy cannons if you are actively starving to death or running for your life from an attack.
Now, Part 7, the archaeological reality. This brings us to honestly the most frustrating part of this entire investigation. Why, with all our modern technology, does the physical evidence remain so totally inconclusive? Well, because the dirt does tell a story, it's just not a complete one. Archaeologists have found English artifacts, like a 16th century signet ring and various gun parts, mixed directly into indigenous sites on Hatteras Island. This definitely proves sustained contact and integration. But look at the rest of the picture. There's a complete absence of mass graves. There is no definitive standalone English settlement that has ever been excavated. And we are fighting 400 years of shifting coastal geography. The landscape itself has literally changed, swallowed up by massive storms in the sea. So while the artifacts prove they blended together, they just cannot conclusively map out the final days of all 115 people.
Finally, Part 8. The most likely answer.
Weighing all of this evidence, the historical consensus forms a really fascinating picture. The most likely answer is that the colony didn't just magically vanish. Facing total isolation, massive starvation, and an 800-year drought, they made a calculated, planned decision to survive. They dispersed. They relocated, likely splitting up between Croatoan Island and the mainland, and they integrated into the indigenous communities who had become their closest allies. They simply ceased to exist as a separate, distinct English settlement. But that leaves us with a profound question. Is survival the same as a solution? Because without definitive, undeniable excavation of a site, we are left with an educated reconstruction, not a final verdict. We still don't know how long they lived, how they were treated, or what ultimately became of their descendants.
John White spent the entire rest of his life carrying a question he could never, ever answer. And maybe that's the part of this story that endures the longest. Longer than the artifacts, the hidden map symbols, or the tree ring data. Somewhere between an island of allies and a vast mainland forest, 115 people methodically packed up their lives and simply walked out of recorded history. And all they left us was a single word, carved into wood. It wasn't a warning, it wasn't a goodbye, just a direction, pointing toward an answer we have never quite been able to reach. What really happened when they walked into that tree line? We may never truly know.